Hello and welcome to the Klassiki podcast. I'm your host, Sam Goff. Klassiki is your window into the world of Eastern European film. Subscribers gain access to our library of classic and contemporary titles, as well as filmmaker interviews, video introductions, program notes, and much more. You can sign up for a free trial today at klassiki.online. If you enjoy the show, don't forget to subscribe in your podcast app of choice, and remember you can always get in touch with us at podcast@klassiki.online. We're a few weeks into season 7 of the show, so it's about time to open up the Kino Club, our watch-along exploration of the Klassiki catalogue. For this edition, I spoke with one of our favourite critics, Botagoz Koilybayeva, who's written for the Klassiki Journal, among many other outlets, and who helps to run the Kazakh feminist film festival Kizkaras. As always, I asked Botagoz to pick a film from our library that she hadn't seen before, watch it, and then jump on a call with me to discuss. And her pick was Tough Kids, the 1983 social drama about teen delinquency and redemption by the sorely underrated Soviet director Dinara Asanova. Botagoz and I got into Asanova's tragically short career and her unusual and controversial working methods, as well as the social and emotional undercurrents of her filmography. Hopefully, you'll feel inspired to check out the film and to start exploring our library for yourself. So follow the links in the show description to watch along with us on Klassiki. You'll also find links to some of Botagoz's recent work, including a wonderful essay on one of our favourite directors, Ali Hamraev. Botagoz, welcome to the show. Welcome to the Kino Club.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Pleasure is all mine. Been meaning to get you on to pick your brains on something for a while now. And the film that you've plumped for at the end of the day is Tough Kids by Dinara Asanova. A really interesting film by a really interesting and I think still pretty underappreciated, underknown filmmaker from the Soviet Union. So yeah, let's just start off with Asanova herself, because I think we're both interested in shedding some light on her in particular. So what do you, before we get into the film, what do you think people should know about Dinara Asanova and about her filmmaking approach?
Yeah, I think Asanova is, as you mentioned, is very and undeservedly underrepresented. It's also due to the fact that she passed away when she was very young,
Yeah.
42 years old. But essentially, she was born in what is nowadays Bishkek, the capital of Kyrgyzstan, but studied at VGIK, and her classmate was Sergei Solovyev, a renowned filmmaker in his own right.
This is
So,
VGIK, the film school in
abs-
Moscow, the central film school of the Soviet Union, and still of Russia now.
yes, yeah, this is the Mecca of all the filmmakers of the former Soviet Union, I believe. Yes, so after her stint there, which was, we should say 60s, late 60s, early 70s. And after that, she was jobless for a while. And I believe it was hard for her to kind of find her way into the studio system in the Soviet Union at that time. But then, very luckily, she found a job, or she got offered a job at Lenfilm, which is in Leningrad nowadays, St. Petersburg.
Mm.
That's how she kind of started working as a full-time director, and she only worked with that studio. And yeah, that's her beginnings. And she's mostly known for making quote unquote children's films because she
Mm.
worked a lot with primarily adolescents, young adults, and from underprivileged backgrounds, difficult children, so to speak.
Listeners
And
can't see the air quotes you just did there, but yeah.
yes, and but it's also in a weird way, I think she was pigeonholed into that kind of niche that she had found, that she is this filmmaker who works only with these difficult children and with the issues that comes with that. But I believe her movies are much, much deeper than that. Having rewatched them recently and also leading up to our conversation today, I was actually very surprised by how mature the works are. There is nothing childish or infantile or anything about her work.
Yeah, I guess. Well, there's several things there. One is the idea of what a youth or children's film meant in the Soviet system. It was a kind of particular type of production, which came with certain expectations. So her ability to work within and against that, I guess, informs part of what you're saying. Yeah, just on her kind of her background, her life. Like you say, she's from Kyrgyzstan, so to be a Kyrgyz, a Central Asian director, and to be a woman working in one of the big Russian studios at Lenfilm is itself marks her out as a kind of unusual case, which is obviously interesting. And how that affected her filmmaking sensibilities, I'm sure a very open-ended question. People might be interested one of the first kind of jobs she had was working with Larissa Shepitko, who people are probably more aware of on the film that Shepitko made in Kyrgyzstan in the early 60s called Heat, which you can find on YouTube if you want. And the other thing I'd just say is about Lenfilm. So like you say, she ends up working in Leningrad at Lenfilm. And Lenfilm, particularly in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, had this reputation for what some scholars call like Soviet art house. It had a reputation as the studio where you could make more serious, more poetic, more formally interesting films, that they were more open to that kind of experimentation. It's a relative term, experimentation in the Soviet context, but just to say that I think that probably helped her as well, because as I'm sure we'll get into, her filmmaking method was really one to set the nerves of the Soviet studio system on edge. So yeah, like you say, she moves there in the early 70s, and then she stays there for her sadly brief career, and she died in 1985, I think. So just a few years after this film we're talking about today, Tough Kids, was released in 1983, and she died of a heart attack or heart disease, I think. All right, so that's Asanova. We'll get back into some of those points, I'm sure. But the film that you've chosen, Tough Kids, it's a slightly awkward translation, English rendering of the Russian Patsani. I don't know how you would translate that Russian title if you had the choice, but
I was thinking about it actually. I would say like something like street kids. It's like it
yeah,
has
it's
the
like lads
mm-hmm.
or
Yeah,
it
the
has
guy.
a slight edge of bad behavior,
Mm-hmm.
boisterousness. So yeah, why don't we just start off with your first impressions coming to this film? You hadn't seen this Asanova film before. This was her biggest hit, relatively speaking. It was her biggest box office hit. It won her state prize. So, could fairly be considered a kind of pinnacle in her career. What was your first impression?
Oh yeah, it's an interesting film because prior to Tough Kids, I'd seen The Wife Has Left, which is probably not the right way to start your way into Asanova's career because The Wife Has Left is an odd project. And then I saw her film, which is called Woodpeckers Don't Get Headaches, which is this
Mm,
very beautiful coming of age story of really of a young love. And Tough Kids is, I would say, on a completely different spectrum from that. It's a story about young delinquents. This kids, most of them, all of them are boys
yeah.
who are petty criminals, and with the real threat of facing the possibility of real jail time. And in the film, we follow a Soviet initiative at the time, which is loosely, we can translate it as a summer labor and sports camp.
Yeah.
These camps were set up in order to, I guess, straighten those boys, just to make them work, make them exercise, just take them out from the streets. And we followed this particular camp, which is not far from Leningrad, St. Petersburg, and a teacher, like this very, very inspirational and honest man who has this ideals, certain ideals to impart, and particularly he believes in their humanity, in the redemption, that they all have a chance to become quote unquote decent, normal Soviet citizens. So that's the premise, and there are certain boys that end up being kind of the drivers of the story of the plot line. But at the same time, I think Asanova finds all of them very interesting. And the movie opens, if you remember, with this in this very beautiful documentary style,
Yeah.
when set against the green wall, the boys are being asked questions like, "What is kindness? What is happiness? Could you ever hit anyone? What is evil?" And they respond to these questions in a very profound way, right?
Yeah.
Um,
It's an interesting, you're kind of, yeah, the first thing you see are these, they're kind of close up down the camera, kind of talking head
yeah.
segments. And it's interesting, like you say, they're asking them these kind of sociological, if you like, questions. And then the last question that all of them get asked is, what is a good person? And it's the one question that none of them can answer, which I think is quite a neat way of setting up the film that follows. Because these kids, these boys, are then the ones who are the protagonists of this fictional narrative. So it's the play there between fiction and non-fiction, which is very Asanova-esque, I think, right from the bat.
Mhm. Definitely. And maybe here we can mention that Asanova was known for her unconventional way of working with her actors. Most of her actors were recruited from these detention centers, from orphanages, from so all the protagonists in Kids essentially play versions of themselves. This approach has been contested. There are two camps, I would say, generally. People who believe there was some kind of like a bad omen. Essentially, a lot of them ended up being real criminals when they grew up, or
Right.
they had very difficult lives. Something that we see the movie working against. And then, yes, so there is this an interesting, an interesting phenomenon here. But just going back to her unconventional style, which I really appreciate, is her commitment to a certain kind of veracity and truth seeking, that she believed that privileged kids, and here I mean kids who have parents and more or less stable upbringing, they cannot convey all the rough experiences of inner internal kind of struggles that these boys are grappling with on a day-to-day basis. So she that was her conviction. So therefore she was working with this kid essentially as a being a teacher herself in
Yeah.
that sense, or having this kind of teaching approach.
And I mean, we see that in the first kind of scene proper, the first kind of fully fictionalized scene, which is one of the younger kids who's going to become one of the main characters is literally on trial for, I think he's pickpocketed a bit of some rubles or something, and he's facing several years in prison. And there's this very kind of starkly, barely shot kind of Soviet courtroom in Leningrad, and the judge is typically unsympathetic, and then the guy who runs the labor camp, who will be, I guess, our main protagonist, who's this former athlete, former gymnast, which is an important part of his character, kind of
Mhm.
comes and gives a kind of statement or evidence in support of this kid, and says, like, his parents are alcoholics, he hasn't got a mother, his father's an alcoholic, they don't Yeah, he does the kind of classic sociological explanation for juvenile delinquency, basically, and they say, okay, fine, he can go to prison later, but you get to look after him for the next year or so. So we get that it delivered very kind of matter of factly down the camera. the like the kind of sociological, anthropological explanation for the behavior that we then see kind of unfold once we then get to the pastoral rural world of the labor camp itself. I mean, I guess we should mention, right, Asanova's very particular and for the Soviet system very unusual technique of using a lot of improvisation set, and this was particularly tricky in the Soviet context because I think when people think of censorship in inverted commas in Soviet cinema, what they might not know exactly how it worked. The main way that kind of control was exerted was in the scripting process. Scripting process was very long, went through a lot of stages of kind of approval and revision. And there was this very strong presumption that scripts would be filmed verbatim, right? So you don't have to be on set censoring everything that's happening if you kind of approve the script in advance and then it's delivered verbatim. So Asanova's use of improvisation was, I think, from what I've read, was the thing that caused the headache for the studio.
Yes, yeah, I think she was notorious for being, again, quote unquote, difficult. And on this film, she worked with a very prominent writer and a screenwriter, Yuri
Yeah.
Klepikov. And they, I think, also had an interesting dynamic relationship at times because he was known for putting a lot of thought into his screenplays. So they were quite meticulous, and he obviously wanted them to be, as you said, verbatim. But Dinara, in her style, she had a tendency to change his script. So that was also something that contributed to her contributed to her reputation for being difficult.
Yeah, I think certainly she wouldn't have got away with it outside of Len film. Let's just say, like her previous film, oh, not previous, but Woodpeckers Don't Get Headaches it wasn't banned, but it caused that there was a lot of back and forth between her and the studio during post production, and eventually it got a kind of very limited release. So it wasn't censored out, put on the shelf outright, but it was, it got a soft release, shall we say. Whereas Tough Kids was much more successful, much more widely seen. So yeah, I mean, we've mentioned the opening kind of documentary sequence, the opening courtroom sequence, and then we get to the world of the camp, and the cinematography changes. It becomes much more handheld, much freer, much more ground level, much more mobile, and we're basically just immersed into the world of these boys and their relationship with the camp leader. I mean, what are some moments, some scenes, or maybe some characters that you would pick out as being particularly representative of what Asanova's doing?
Yeah, I really like those early sequences of this. Essentially, there's this kind of sense of joy and almost an innocence in those scenes. And as you've mentioned, yeah, there are way more light. There's a lot of handheld shots. We see kids really being kids, playing, swimming, but working at the same time. I think they were building a cottage. Yeah,
I think they're
there are some
demolishing a
scenes when
cottage,
we
aren't they?
see
I think
them or demolishing.
they're
That's
knocking down
correct.
an old
But they were
barn, I think, and then some of them are harvesting beetroots. Very Russian activity to be doing.
yes, yeah, gardening and that is correct. And actually, this barn will play, well, it will play into the narrative, particularly the
Mm.
bricks from that old barn. Yeah, so and we get introduced to Pavel, who is the camp leader, more, and to his partner in crime, a sort of bad cop, who is another camp leader who is not a favorite one, let's say. And I think in those early sequences, we maybe Asanova introduces a certain kind of psychology of Pavel and Pavel's approach that helps him to develop this intimate relationship with these kids because they respect him, they listen to him, and admire, I would even say. But at the same time, they treat him less than a father, but more as a friend or
Yeah.
an older brother. And this, I think, largely also, if we just kind of zoom out, I think it also encompasses Asanova's approach, as you mentioned earlier, how she liked improvising. And I think the reason why she liked improvising with her actors, it's because she really felt that they were interesting people, that they had a lot to bring to their characters, even though they were very young, delinquents or
Yeah, it's
criminals.
interesting what you mentioned, the sense of joy, particularly towards the beginning of the film. I mean, the demands of narrative mean that there's some conflicts and drama down the line. But I was really struck by that because you could imagine this as a kind of punitive experience. It's a well, when you say labor camp, I think it has some certain connotations for people, I think. But it's really, I think, striking the amount of kind of libidinal energy that there is and the amount of music and play. I mean, one of they seem to have a kind of like homegrown band who are constantly kind of soundtracking events with this kind of early 80s Soviet rock music stylings, which is an amazing kind of period detail. And they have this kind of nightly dance session, basically, where Pavel will shoot a flare in the air to mark the beginning of dancing, and then they
Right.
just kind of rave out for a bit, and they're kind of swimming in the lake. I don't know. It's just that sense of liberation, I think, comes as a bit of a surprise, both within the Soviet context and also just within the context of yeah, like the criminality, basically, that is the reason for this camp in the first place. And I was put in mind
Right.
of, so this film is in 1983, right? So that's actually before Perestroika, officially is declared in the Soviet Union. But this film really reminds me of this kind of Perestroika era trend towards social issue films. And this was one of the main trends, certainly in Soviet culture, as a result of Perestroika and Glasnost, was suddenly you had kind of TV shows, books, films that were allowed to really get into these kind of sociological issues, say like teen delinquency. So there would be a lot more of this in the years to come. I just think it's interesting that Asanova was there actually before that wave broke with this film, and maybe that influenced her. Not that influenced her, sorry. Maybe that speaks to the very particular tone, the tightrope she walks between kind of tension and liberation.
That's nicely put. I think, yeah, in some ways she was a precursor of that larger trend that followed. And going back to that scene, that dance scene that you've mentioned, I think it also is part of that routine that we get to see in the first half of the film. That's also, I think, the fundamental part of any camp or summer camp, where there is a certain routine, where discipline is emphasized, and certain certain rituals are emphasized. So there is this evening meal that they all have at a very long table where they're all sitting together and they're eating at the same time. And if someone has a birthday, that boy would receive some
Mm.
chocolates or some candies. And there is a sense of security, I think, that the film is trying to create, or a sense of stability, maybe, that the film is trying to create, even though we can feel, I think, as audience, that something is going to go down because we know that our boys are they can do something wrong or something can go wrong. But yeah, that's I guess what I meant when I said a
Yeah.
sense of joy.
Well, there are these two, I guess they're slightly older guys who, when the film starts, have been expelled from the camp and they're basically living under a tarpaulin on a neighboring island on this lake they're in. And they kind of have to row over and give them buckets of potatoes to live off of over the course of the film. And they are maybe the characters where the criminality is concentrated, because I mean there's quite a disturbing scene where there's an interesting kind of cross-cutting. The rest of the kids are doing, their parents have come to visit and they're giving them kind of musical performances and gymnastic performances, and it's actually quite tender and nice, but it's kind of cross-cut with these other two outcast kids basically sexually assaulting a tourist. And yeah, that's a particularly, that's when you see, okay, actually, you know, Asanova is actually alive to the issues, shall we say?
Yeah, it's like those kids are the
Yeah.
bad apples among bad apples. Yeah, that scene, I did find that scene disturbing, particularly rewatching it now with and I believe at that time it must have been also shocking to
Mm.
see this kind of scene.
I wanted to I wanted
Yes.
to ask you, because I was watching it, I was imagining how this might have been different had it been a Western, and how it might have framed the question of, you know, criminality, these sociological questions as we've been calling them. And I was thinking about how there are very, if you're interested in these kind of things, it's a great example of kind of Soviet ways of thinking about things like justice and rehabilitation and youth development and so on. And I was thinking, you know, like, where does the blame or the explanation lie for Asanova and Klepikov, the screenwriter here? You know, like, who is to blame ultimately for the way these kids are? Is it their parents? Is it Soviet society more broadly, which would be a much more risky angle to take? At one point, Pavel is explaining his method to someone and he says, well, we need to teach them shame. We need to teach these kids shame in order to wake up their hearts, I think is how he puts it. I don't know what, I just wondered what your take was as you were watching it.
Yes, I think this idea of shame is it's a multi-layered kind of construct, really, because I think it evokes personal shame, internal shame for, which is not self-shame. I think it's these are two distinct things. The shame that you feel because you had done something bad
Mm,
externally. And this requires a moment of self-reflection because you have to realize that you have done something bad. And then the shame is the right feeling to feel. And I think Pavel's method tried to kind of probe that construct, or like really wake the kids up to this external shame, the feeling of that. Yeah, and I think there is also shame that is more traditionally, that we traditionally understand as something which is, yeah, quite personal, and that may not even be related to any of the external
yeah.
social phenomenon. These kids are criminals, so they obviously, factually do something bad. And they, by law of nature, by Soviet law, they should feel bad about it. So, and I believe that was Pavel's strong conviction. But the way you can also evoke that shame, there are different methods to do that. It can be physically punished for that. Or as I think Pavel was trying to do, he was trying to lead them by example because he was healthy, he was strong, he was this kind of he was trying to be a model of a model citizen, if you will. Pavel wasn't dogmatic in his approach. He didn't preach the Soviet values necessarily. There is, however, one scene which I believe is a crucial scene, and I was wondering what you think about it when kids the kids do something very unpleasant to him, and he really loses it at that point. He gets very angry, and then there is this kind of monologue or raging monologue that he gives, and I think in that monologue gives away his agenda, like
Yeah.
broader agenda. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I mean that whole sequence of is super interesting because basically what happens is the bad cop, kind of co-director of the camp who you mentioned, is being cruel basically to the kids who are demolishing this barn, and they basically develop class consciousness. It's actually quite a kind of old-fashioned Soviet moment. They basically rise up against the overseer.
Yeah.
But as a result of that, they then kind of it gets out of hand. It goes from kind of class consciousness to mob
Mhm.
irrationality, and they kind of trash the camp, and they kind of throw all the food everywhere, and that is what sets Pavel off. Yeah, and that scene where he kind of gathers them all around him in a circle and delivers this diatribe, this really impassioned speech or critique of them. And the camera's really in close with him. The camera is inside the circle of the children,
Right.
in his face, kind of moving around them. Really strikingly captured. Yeah, and that is the point in the film that moralism like enters
Yes.
the picture. And he says, "Do you know what bread is? Do you know what bread is worth and where it comes from?" Which is a really kind of
Yes, it evokes
there's the labor values of
absolutely. I think
of
it
that.
also evokes a lot of memories of particularly for people from Leningrad,
Yeah, that's a really good
of the
point.
siege of
Yeah,
Leningrad,
yeah.
where there are all sorts of nightmarish stories that we learn about it at school, and yeah, so that emphasis on bread is crucial.
Yeah, that hadn't occurred to me at all actually. I guess if he's in his 50s, say 40s or 50s, then he's a product of that history in a way that really really informs that because it's particularly the fact that they've trashed the food. That's the thing that's really unforgivable for him. And I guess it's interesting because if you were looking for signs of kind of the demands of the Soviet studio system, or if you were looking to critique the film, the openness of the kids to his critique and the way that they basically instantly react by feeling sorry and cleaning everything up and accepting the errors of their ways and stuff can feel a little bit rote. I don't know. It feels quite. We're coming to the end of the film, and I'm thinking it's a bit of a shame almost that it ends on this with this neatness. But then there is this final step that Asanova takes to end on a moment of kind of suspended tension, which is actually really interesting, and as far as I'm concerned kind of rescues the film because it ends with this really bleak point, which is that the kid who we saw at the beginning who was on trial and he's facing a kind of suspended jail sentence, he finds out that his sister had gone back to live with their alcoholic father. The alcoholic father had got drunk and like violently shaved her head, and then the girl had tried to kill herself by turning on the gas, by gas poisoning. And the boy takes Pavel's flare gun to basically attempt to go off and try and kill his dad. And that's the end of the film. And
Well,
well,
there is this beautiful moment of brotherhood, I would like to say. And uh, and it's interesting that you're saying it was bleak. You thought that sequence.
Well, I just mean that it's in 1983. It's an unusually bleak
Mm.
series of events to be related in a Soviet film.
Right. Mm.
Like a girl attempting to kill herself because her drunk dad is abusing her is not a super common
Yeah, no,
turn
absolutely,
up.
absolutely. The events that kind of led up to this moment, this kind of surge of solidarity, and maybe that's why this ending, and essentially all the boys, all the tough kids in the camp decide to prevent this young boy to kill his father. Right? They're just running after him, all collectively, without Pavel, the camp leader, even saying anything. So they all start running after him, trying to stop this potential act of murder
Mm.
and and potentially this boy's life ruined forever. So in that sense, I find the ending to be quite hopeful.
Well, it's hopeful, but it is ambiguous and suspended because it ends on this sequence of them all running
Right.
towards him, towards out of the camp, towards the town. But she's smart enough to end the film there.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. But I think it also kind of going back to our conversation about shame, and I think this moment beautifully symbolizes this organic development of that feeling that all the boys felt. And I think they felt in that scene when we were just talking about when Pavel was raging and that scene of moralism. And boys responded that they were sorry. And that means that feeling of shame naturally occurred. They actually felt it rather than they had been forced to feel it. And in that way, the sequence after it, essentially the ending of the movie of them all running after that other boy, I think beautifully kind of highlights that the development of them as them
yeah.
maturing, them growing up.
Well, yeah, I think we've covered some of what makes Asanova and this film Tough Kids so interesting. I think if people are looking for comparisons or parallels, one thing I found interesting is that when she was making her previous film, Asanova asked the studio for permission. If you wanted to watch foreign films for research, you had to ask permission to kind of get them out of the vaults. And the films that she asked to watch were If by Lindsay Anderson and A Clockwork Orange by Stanley Kubrick. So if you're looking for a very vague comparison before you dive into Asanova, then there you go. She's the Soviet Lindsay Anderson and Stanley Kubrick. Yeah, and I have a couple of quotes that I failed to kind of thread into our conversation from her that I just think are really telling. So there's one, we've been talking about this as like a youth film, but she herself was very opposed to the idea or the label of a youth film or a children's film, because she always said that she wanted to show that there were no different truths for different age groups.
Absolutely.
And I think that's one skeleton key kind of understanding for this film. And then the other one is just a line that I really like, which is cinema is the blood that I suck from other people's lives. So her immersion in the detail and the reality of life, the veracity as you put it, I think comes from this sense of it being a kind of life force that she was drawing on, like a
That's
vampire.
so interesting. And it's actually there are numerous accounts of her collaborators from Solovyov and all the people who knew her who attribute a sort of kind of witchy powers to her, like she was some kind of
Mm.
a sorcerer because apparently she had predicted her own death, possibly because she knew that she had
Oh, she knew she had a heart
yes,
condition. And
but
it's
maybe she was also being a trickster of sorts. But she knew that she would die in her 40s, and that made her, I think that contributed to her being very hungry for life in a way, being very truthful and committed to seeking truth. I think she was really adamant about it. And this is also interesting interesting why she was exploring stories about children, because there is this certain immediacy of life in the lives of young people. Life just feels boundless and infinite when you're young. And in a way, I think Asanova was really was a sorceress of those stories.
Well, that's a nice one. I wasn't expecting a supernatural angle at the end of this kind of social realism episode, but it's a nice way to round it off, I think. But yeah, I think that's Dinara Asanova, a highly recommended filmmaker. Watch Tough Kids on Klassiki now. And Botagoz Koilybayeva, thanks so much for coming on the Kino Club. Thanks so much for talking to me today about Asanova and Tough Kids.
Thank you so much for having me. Goodbye.